When we're talking about this as it's going on before our very eyes right now in this synod in Rome right now, with Francis quasi-pontificating, meaning for him listening to what these people are saying, listening to what the people, now listening to what the young people are saying about their faith, so the church can learn the faith from them, okay? I want you to notice something, that Francis is carrying what is called a stang. This in place of the bishop's staff. He's not carrying a crozier. He's not carrying a pastoral staff. He's not carrying something surmounted by a crucifix. Not even that distorted, twisted quasi-crucifix that Paul VI and his followers have introduced. Not even that. Francis is carrying a witch's staff. He's carrying a witch's stang, S-T-A-N-G. You can see it in the photographs coming from the Synod for the youth. And this witch's stang was presented to him by two young women. Well, not so young. One of them, at least, was 30 years old. Why she's at this youth conference, I don't know. And it's very, very clear in the photographs that she is wearing a witch's bracelet, the red knotted cord around her wrist, which you see on the wrists of the followers of the Kabbalah, There are pictures of Madonna wearing the knotted red cord, betokening her following of the Kabbalah. And she, with that very same hand, which is adorning this knotted red cord of the Kabbalah, a satanic symbol, is presenting Francis with this stang, the satanic staff, which symbolizes the authority of Satan. Look into it yourselves. You'll see exactly what I'm saying. This is notorious now. I'd be surprised if any of you have not yet heard this, because it is so widely known now that this is taking place because of the scandal that has arisen from it. And when these young women, more or less young women, presented this to Francis back in, I think, April of this year at a gathering in the Circus Maximus, they said to him that they wished he would carry this at the Youth Synod, and that's exactly what he's doing. It is scandalous that he's doing this. People ask, does he realize what it represents? Well, by now he certainly realizes it. He must know what it represents. But even if he didn't recognize it when it was presented to him, you'd think if he had a Catholic cell in his body, he would say, this is not a crozier, this is not a pastoral staff, this is not a crucifix. What is this thing? You'd think if he had a bit of common sense, he would check it out too. But he certainly realizes what it represents now, by now. He's been carrying it throughout the Synod for youth, and they're applauding him. Even as he's listening to them dictate what the faith is, their faith experience is now. But you see, Francis is applauding Paul VI, and he's planning on canonizing Paul VI. And all one need do is look at the monumental portrait of Paul VI done over a 20-year period by a German Ernst Günther Hansing, a Lutheran, not a Catholic gentleman, who has actually given room in the Vatican to paint this so-called portrait of Paul VI. And we should have that on the screen for you to actually see this right now. If you have time to study it, you see, it appears that St. Peter's Basilica is falling to ruin all around him. You ask, how can this be a portrait of Paul VI? Where is Paul VI in this scene of destruction, where the towers and the pillars of St. Peter's are collapsing in on each other, and everything looks as though it's in the process of disintegrating, the church in the process of disintegrating. But then you see, in the lower center of this very amazing portrait, which is, oh my goodness, it must be close to 10 feet tall. You see a small, relatively small head, it's probably life-size, of Paul VI, looking demonic. He's actually apparently hunched over, and through these squinting but piercing eyes, he has a look of diabolical fury and hatred. This is a portrait of Paul VI, and a portrait that Paul VI himself approved. In fact, Paul VI is quoted as commenting on that portrait that it is an accurate representation of the situation of the church at our time. That is Paul VI's assessment of this so-called portrait of his pontificate, which represents the church just collapsing in on itself, basically imploding. There are so many Masonic symbols in this, there's a whole list of them that are provided by those who study this portrait. But it is really a very interesting statement that Paul VI made, that this accurately represents the condition of the church in our time. Is it any wonder, therefore, to see Francis following in the line of Paul VI, following the map charted out by Paul VI as to where the church must go, and now coming up with this Church of the Synod, this synodal church envisioned by Paul VI, even as Francis is implementing this vision and about to canonize Paul VI as a saint of the new order. People have to ask themselves where all of this is going. There are many already who see clearly where it's going. St. Pius X saw clearly well over 100 years ago where all this was going. And he condemned all of this already before it even had taken place. All that's necessary is someone to take St. Pius X seriously, read what he wrote, and decipher it and understand it, and connect it to the events that are actually taking place before our very eyes today, to realize that modernism is having its heyday in the devastation of the church. In fact, there's an account of an exchange between St. Pius X and one of the cardinals. A cardinal who, after Anticipate Nostro in 1910, where St. Pius X implemented the oath against modernism for anyone who would be raised to authority in the church, become a cleric in the church. Anyone who would hear confessions or preach or have any position of authority in the church had to make this oath against modernism before the open tabernacle. Anyone who would be ordained to the subdiaconate, the diaconate, the priesthood, had to pronounce this oath against modernism with his right hand on the Gospels before the tabernacle, the presence of our Lord, and swear that he would not do what the modernists, would not do what St. Pius X condemned in his encyclical against the modernists. And so the cardinal congratulated St. Pius X on having turned back the modernists, having thwarted them in their designs. And allegedly St. Pius X sadly shook his head and said to the cardinal, "What I have done has merely made the modernists withdraw somewhat. But in 50 years, in half a century, they will be back to lay waste the church." We are seeing that. Remember, from 1910 to 1960, 50 years, John the 23rd calling Vatican II, saying it was a divine inspiration. Just like Francis saying it was a divine message from God to have communist bishops in the church. Yes, they attribute it, but to what God are they attributing this? How many gods can there be? There's only one true God. They must be attributing this to some false god of theirs. But that's what the modernists have. They believe in a God of surprises. They believe in a God of experiences, whom mankind experiences by their religious sentiment. That is not the true God revealing himself. Not in the eyes of a Catholic, anyway. Not in the mind of the Catholic Church. We need to really take stock of where this is all heading. It's heading where St. Pius X said exactly where it would. Where it would head to the area of atheism and pantheism combined. Atheism in the denial of the true God, pantheism of man exalting himself, as Satan did, to the very throne of God, mankind becoming God for itself. That's where it's going right now, in a one-world religion under the control of an Antichrist. So, dear people, we have to understand what's going on here. We read the encyclical against modernism, and we see all the elements spoken of as condemned by St. Pius X, which are now the very creed of the modernists. It is on the basis of these very principles St. Pius X condemned that the modernists are proceeding in building their church, not Christ's church, their church, which will become the church of the Antichrist. Anyway, we'll continue our treatment of modernism in order to draw the parallels between the modernist creed and what we're witnessing happening today. As point by point by point, practically line by line in the encyclical of Pius X, we see him spelling out for us, forecasting for us, well over 100 years ago, exactly what we're seeing taking place now. And a word to the wise would be adequate right now to realize we cannot follow these modernists and what they're doing. We have to return to the practice of the traditional practice of the traditional Catholic faith. Its Mass, its sacraments, and the very concept of the Church itself is at stake here. So with that, I bid you farewell now and hope to see you later. God bless you. Please pray for me. I will be praying for you.